Snow was falling like quiet prayers over the lonely valley when an aging German shepherd came limping out of the tree line, his breath rising in weak, fragile clouds. Behind him, an old man in a tattered leather jacket stepped into the cold, staring at the ruins of the ranch he had abandoned decades ago. He thought he was returning to ashes and memories, but somewhere beyond those collapsed beams and frozen fences, a trapped wild horse was waiting a creature who should have died long ago, yet still fought to live. What the old man and his loyal dog discovered in that hidden canyon would change everything they believed about strength, forgiveness, and the miracles God leaves behind for those willing to look. Before we begin this journey of hope and redemption, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Your story matters too. The winter sun over Cedar Ridge did not shine. It merely hung there, a pale and exhausted coin suspended in a sky the color of washed steel. Wind poured down from the granite peaks in long, icy ribbons, threading through the pines with a mournful hiss, as if the mountains themselves whispered warnings no one alive could decipher anymore. Driving through that barren quiet was Elias Ward, 63 years old and looking every bit like a man carved out of old storms. His battered Ford pickup groaned beneath him as he guided it up the rutted road toward a place he had sworn on his youth, his pride, and even on his mother's grave, never to return. Ward Hollow, the farm that had belonged to his family for 3 generations, before fire turned it into a blackened skeleton. On the passenger seat, sitting with the solemn dignity of a retired general, was Hawk, his 11-year-old German shepherd. The dog's coat, dark charcoal mixed with silver, rippled in the cold draft sneaking through the cracked window. Hawk's amber eyes watched the landscape with grave attention, as if reading signals hidden in the snowdrifts. His ears twitched at every sound, every shift of wind, every memory Elias tried not to feel. Elias tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his hands, scarred, stiff, and still carrying the tremble of old battlefields, felt cold even through the worn leather gloves. Just one signature, he muttered to himself. One signature and we're gone. He wasn't speaking to Hawk, but the dog responded anyway, leaning closer, placing his head gently on Elias's thigh. It wasn't comfort, it was a reminder. Hawk always did that when Elias lied to himself. Ahead, Ward Hollow loomed like a grave marker. The chimney of the old farmhouse still stood, a charred pillar against the pale sky. Around it, the ashen remains of the barn, the shed, the fences, all lay crushed beneath decades of snow, storms, and silence. This was supposed to be the day he let it all go, sold it to Braxton Hale, the wealthiest rancher in the region, a man with more land than compassion. Elias parked the truck. The engine sputtered once, sighed, then fell quiet. Silence settled over him like frost. Hawk raised his head again, ears pricking forward. "What is it?" Elias whispered. Hawk did not bark. He did not growl. Instead, he stood up, slowly, deliberately, and pressed his paw against the door. A signal, a clear message. Something is out there. Elias forced the frozen door open. The cold slapped him hard enough to make his eyes sting. Hawk jumped out lightly despite his age, nose sweeping the air, tail stiff. Then he moved. Not searching, not curious, purposeful. The dog trotted across the half-collapsed yard, past the ruins of the barn, cutting a straight path through weeds brittle as bone. Elias followed, leaning on his walking stick, breath turning to white smoke. Hawk headed toward the narrow split in the earth that locals called Devil's Stairs, where stone cliffs folded together like the jaws of an ancient creature. "Where are you taking me, boy?" Elias murmured, but he already trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. The narrow pass funneled them into a canyon, hidden from the world. The wind died the moment they stepped inside. Snow lay thick here, untouched, undisturbed, with no tracks except those Hawk left behind. Halfway through the gorge, Hawk stopped, whined, pressed low to the ground, and stared toward the deepest shadow beneath the overhanging rock. Elias squinted. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. Then, the darkness moved. It shifted, trembling, and the outline sharpened into the unmistakable silhouette of a horse, a Mustang, wild by birth and suffering by neglect. Its coat, once amber brown, was now matted with mud in winter. Ribs jutted like broken pickets along its sides. Its mane hung in tangled ropes. But it was the hooves that made Elias's stomach drop. They were long, horribly long, grown out like twisted horns curling back and up, forcing the animal to stand on the edges of pain. The creature swayed, struggling to stay upright. Every breath came out in a thin, ragged plume. "Oh, God," Elias whispered. The Mustang stared at him, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and the stubbornness of something that had refused to die long after it should have. There was a wild intelligence in that gaze, wariness, fire, and a deep ancient endurance that mirrored something inside Elias he had never managed to bury, something forgotten, something wounded. Elias stepped closer, very slowly. Hawk didn't move, but his tail lowered, his posture softening into a posture of respect. He seemed to understand the delicacy of the moment better than any man could. The Mustang flinched, lifting one twisted hoof that sent agony rippling up its leg. It staggered and nearly fell. Only instinct kept it standing. "You poor soul," Elias murmured. "How long have you been trapped here?" There was no food, no water. The canyon walls blocked escape. No tracks led out. Someone had abandoned the animal, or worse, driven it here. Elias clenched his jaw. Guilt and memory mixed in his chest like smoke from an old battlefield. Watching the Mustang struggle, he saw flashes of young soldiers he had held in his arms decades ago, their eyes full of questions they never got to ask. Survival had a look. This horse wore it. Hawk pressed gently against Elias's leg as if urging him to act. "No," Elias whispered, shaking his head. "We didn't come here to stay." But the words tasted like lies, just as they always had. He crouched slowly, wincing as his knee cracked, snow soaked through his jeans. He reached out a hand, not to touch, but to offer presence, a silent truce older than any language. The Mustang didn't relax, but it didn't try to flee either. It simply trembled there, caught between surrender and survival. Elias swallowed hard. He had come here to sell the land, to erase the last ruin of his family's history, to walk away, to forget, to stop carrying the weight of a fire he wasn't brave enough to face back then. But now, here, in this frozen canyon, was a creature left to die, a creature abandoned on land that still carried his family's name, a creature that looked at him the way his father once had in those last painful years, pleading without asking. And Elias Ward, a man who had run from every ghost in his life, felt something shift inside him, a small, stubborn ember, duty, memory, and something even he dared not name yet. Hawk nudged him again, a gentle, steady push. "I know," Elias whispered. "I know, boy." The cold bit harder. Snow drifted down like silent ash. Elias took a breath so deep it hurt. Then he spoke the words he had spent 30 years avoiding. "We're not leaving, not yet." The Mustang blinked once, slow and trembling, as if it understood the promise buried inside that simple vow. And Hawk, loyal, aging Hawk, sat beside Elias, ears forward, guarding the fragile beginning of a decision that would change all three of their lives. The wind shifted as Elias Ward made his way back toward the ruined homestead. Hawk pressed close to his knee like a seasoned escort, guiding a weary commander. The world outside the canyon felt strangely louder after the heavy stillness where the Mustang stood trapped, as though the valley itself exhaled now that Elias had spoken those fateful words. "We're not leaving." The sky over Cedar Ridge had darkened into a bruised violet by the time they reached the broken fences of Ward Hollow. Elias stopped beside the truck, his breath steaming in long, uneven plumes. His fingers throbbed inside his gloves. Cold crept into the joints of his spine, like icy screws twisting deeper with each breath. He was too old to be making promises to dying creatures in forgotten canyons. Too old, and yet not too far gone to know right from wrong. Hawk circled the truck once, then sat in front of Elias, gaze steady, ears forward. The same posture he took when awaiting orders back in their younger years, when neither of them knew how fragile a life's purpose could be. "I hear you, boy," Elias muttered, "but this isn't the kind of mess we can muscle through." His voice sounded thin, defeated, embarrassingly mortal in the empty yard. He opened the truck's door and pulled out the only blanket he kept for emergencies, an old wool square faded by sun and time. He draped it across his shoulders, steadying himself against the doorframe, as another wave of pain clenched the base of his spine. Hope, the name had formed quietly in his mind on the walk back, would not last the night if left there alone. The Mustang was dehydrated, starving, and possibly fighting infection. But Elias had nothing here. No barn intact enough to hold an animal, no grain, no hay, not even a functioning water pump. Ward Hollow was a skeleton, and he was an old soldier clinging to a history he hadn't had the courage to face. But the canyon horse did not know that. All it knew was hunger, thirst, pain, and that someone had looked at it without turning away. Elias lifted his head. The ruins loomed before him, outlined by the faint silver glow of the moon creeping over the ridge. Beneath the collapsed beams of the old barn, he saw something he hadn't noticed earlier. The corner of a wooden trapdoor. Dust and char covered it, but it remained intact. The storm cellar. His father had built it decades ago, back when winters were harsher and hope came in the form of a shovel and hard labor. Elias remembered helping to carry down jars of preserves, stacking them by season, organizing them as if survival itself depended on order. Now, the cellar might be the only shelter he had left. Hawk followed him as he limped across the yard and shoved aside charred debris. Beneath the weight of half-burned planks, Elias found the hatch. The iron ring was rusted, stiff from years of neglect, but after a few pulls, it cracked open with a groan that sounded like the earth complaining. A wave of stale air hit him, damp, heavy with the scent of old stone and colder years. He lowered the lantern into the darkness. The cellar was shallow but intact. Stone walls, dirt floor, wooden shelves leaning like aging bones. It wasn't warm and it wasn't welcoming, but it was shelter. And it was big enough for a horse, barely. Elias sighed. "We can work with this," he whispered, more to himself than Hawk. The dog wagged his tail once, only once, but it was enough. Hours later, Elias trudged back into the canyon with a coil of rope slung across his shoulder and a sturdy piece of broken door he had repurposed into a makeshift ramp. By then, the moon was higher, painting the canyon walls with an eerie blue glow. Hope stood where he'd left him, trembling from the cold, head low, sides rising and falling with shallow breath. The Mustang's eyes flickered open as Elias approached, reflecting the faint gleam of the lantern like polished obsidian. "All right, son," Elias murmured. "Let's try to get you out of here." He placed the ramp at a slant against the small rock ledge. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than forcing the animal to climb. Hawk lay down a few feet away, body low, showing submission, an invitation for the horse to trust. Elias moved slowly, speaking in a low rumble that had soothed countless skittish soldiers in the past. "Easy now. Lean into it. That's it." Hope hesitated, head tossing weakly. Elias reached forward, not touching the animal, but placing his hand near Hope's cheek, offering presence, not pressure. After a long moment, the Mustang shifted his weight. The first step onto the ramp sent a flash of pain through Hope's twisted hooves. The horse grunted, nearly collapsing, muscles trembling so violently that Elias felt the quake through the ground itself. Hawk rose to his feet and moved a little closer, not enough to threaten, but enough to anchor the moment. "You're all right," Elias whispered, "just one step at a time." Hope tried again. This time the hoof stayed, then the other. A slow, agonizing climb followed, each inch bought with pain, strain, and sheer stubbornness. When the Mustang finally reached the top, Elias nearly cried from relief. He guided Hope with soft clicks of his tongue and gentle murmurs. It took nearly half an hour to clear the canyon, crossing brittle grass and frozen earth, but they made it. The dim outline of Ward Hollow's ruins rose ahead, ragged but familiar, glowing faintly under the lantern's light. The cold carved itself deeper into Elias's bones with every step. Hope stumbled twice, nearly falling. Twice, Hawk pressed his body against the horse's side, steadying him with a surprising gentleness. By the time they reached the cellar door, Elias's legs shook as violently as the Mustang's. He lowered the ramp once more, guiding Hope down the steps and into the shelter. Inside, the stale air seemed to warm slightly simply because they occupied it. Hawk walked the perimeter, sniffing corners, cataloging the space with the precision of a veteran returning to a battlefield. Elias spread the blanket on the dirt for a small cushion and set the lantern on a shelf. Hope lowered himself with a heavy, exhausted sigh, first onto his haunches, then all the way down, shuddering as the cold floor finally gave him a place to rest. Elias sank beside him, one hand resting lightly on Hawk's back. "You're safe now," he whispered. "You're both safe." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. One night of safety would not save Hope. The Mustang needed water, hay, antibiotics, and proper tools to trim those grotesquely curled hooves. Every hour mattered, and Elias had nothing. No money, no contacts in this valley anymore, no barn, no vet, just a battered truck, an old dog with stiffness in his joints, and a wounded horse lying in a hole in the ground. Hawk rested his chin on Elias's thigh, amber eyes fixed on him as though waiting for the verdict. Elias exhaled, breath shaking. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "I'll figure it out. I promise." Hawk blinked slowly, a gesture bordering on faith. Hope exhaled, long and tired, his breath stirring the dust. And in the hollow beneath Cedar Ridge, surrounded by ghosts of a past Elias had tried to bury, 3 broken lives lay in the dim glow of a lantern, bound together now by a decision that could not be undone. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, for the first time in years, Elias did not feel entirely alone. Morning came as a gray thinning of darkness rather than light. In the storm cellar, Elias Ward woke to the sound of shallow, uneven breaths from the Mustang curled against the far wall. Hope's sides rose and fell with a trembling rhythm, the kind born from exhaustion rather than peace. Hawk lay at the base of the steps, guarding the door with the devotion of a soldier who refused to be relieved from duty. Elias sat up slowly, wincing as the cold punished his joints. The ache in his lower back pulsed with each heartbeat, as if reminding him he was no longer the man who once jumped from aircraft without fear of the landing. He rubbed his temples, trying to push away the fog of fatigue. They had survived the night, but survival was not enough. He knelt beside Hope, running a gentle hand along the horse's neck. The skin felt warmer today, but not from a fever. The warmth of a body no longer exposed to the deadening cold. Hope lifted his head slightly, nostrils flaring as if recognizing Elias. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it wasn't terror anymore. It was something fragile, a willingness to believe this human might not harm him. "You held on," Elias whispered. "Now it's my turn." Hawk rose from the steps, stretched stiffly, then approached and nudged Hope's muzzle with cautious curiosity. The Mustang blinked, and though his breath came shallow, he did not pull away. Elias watched the exchange, animal to animal, survivor to survivor, and for a moment felt the kind of quiet hope he had not known since before the fire. But reality intruded like a cold draft through stone. Hope needed far more than shelter. His lungs rattled faintly. Infection was creeping deeper. The twisted hooves had carved pain up through the tendons and into the bones. Without trimming, without medication, without water and real food, the horse would decline rapidly. Elias stood, pain flaring down his spine. He reached for his wallet, more a worn leather pouch than anything. Inside, a few crumpled bills stared back at him. Not enough to buy grain, not enough to buy antibiotics, not enough to buy even a fraction of what Hope needed. His gaze drifted to Hawk. The German shepherd tilted his head, as if sensing the shift in his master's thoughts. "I know," Elias murmured. "I know what we have to do." Outside, the air was sharp enough to cut skin. Elias trudged across the snow-covered yard toward his truck, Hawk following with a low, uncertain whine. The Mustang's fragile refuge disappeared behind the cellar door, swallowed by shadows and cold stone. Elias climbed into the truck and exhaled slowly. The windshield was coated with frost, and as he scraped it away, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection, deep lines crossing his face, eyes hollowed by grief and time. It had been decades since he last stepped into town without shame burning in his chest. But today, shame had no place. Today, necessity drove him. The engine coughed to life, and the truck crawled down the broken path to the main road. Hawk sat beside him in the passenger seat, ears pinned back, as though protesting the errand they both understood. Elias kept one hand on the wheel, and the other pressed lightly on Hawk's soft, graying fur. "Sometimes you give what you can," he said quietly. "Sometimes you give more." The drive to Cedar Ridge Township felt longer than it should have. The snowbanks rose like frozen waves, and the trees beyond them whispered the same doubts that haunted him in the dark of night. He pulled into the first stop, Miller's Feed and Supply, a modest building with faded red paint. Old Mr. Miller had owned it since Elias was a teenager. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, immediately filling his ears with the warm hum of a gas heater. "Elias Ward?" A voice behind the counter called out in disbelief. "Haven't seen you in an age." Elias managed a thin smile. "Good to see you too, Sam." "Need hay, feed, tools?" Sam asked, wiping his hands on a burlap sack. "Heard the old hollow's still standing, more or less." Elias paused, gripping the counter until his knuckles whitened. "I need," he swallowed, "I need everything I can get for a horse. Hay, grain, antibiotics if you've got any, and I need to borrow tools for hoof work." Sam's eyes narrowed. "Sounds like more than one old man and one old dog can handle alone." "It's not for me," Elias murmured. "It's for the horse." Sam didn't ask which horse. He didn't need to. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew the land around Ward Hollow. They knew Mustangs sometimes wandered the cliffs. They knew some were abandoned. "You got money?" Sam asked gently. Elias inhaled. "No, not much." Sam tapped the counter, then shook his head slowly. "I'd help you for free if I could, Elias. But you know how winters hit us. Supplies are tight." Elias nodded, throat tightening. He thanked Sam and walked back to the truck, shoulders heavy with failure. Hawk watched him with quiet understanding. "We're not done yet," Elias said, turning the key again. Their last hope sat at the corner of Cedar and Ridgeway. Templeton Pawn and Trade, a building stuffed with other people's regrets, preserved under fluorescent lights. The door chimed when he entered, and the man behind the counter looked up with a wary frown. "You look like you've seen better decades," the pawnbroker muttered. "Can't argue that," Elias said. "What are you selling?" Elias hesitated. His hand drifted slowly to his wrist. Hidden under the sleeve of his coat was the one object he had never surrendered, not to time, not to memory, not to fire or war. A military-issued wristwatch, his father's last gift, and the only piece of Ward Hollow he had ever carried with him. He unbuckled it with trembling fingers. The pawnbroker's eyes widened. "That's a Hamilton Field vintage model. You know collectors pay good money for these." "I know," Elias said softly. "How much?" The man picked up the watch, turning it carefully. $250, maybe $300 if you want store credit." "Cash," Elias said. The pawnbroker studied his face. "You selling a memory or buying a future?" Elias met his gaze. "Both." A moment of silence passed, heavy, weighted with the cost of what Elias was giving up. Finally the man nodded, counted out bills, handed them across the counter. Elias took the money without looking at it, because if he looked at the empty space on his wrist, he might break. Hawk pressed against his leg in wordless comfort. When Elias returned to Miller's Feed, he bought all he could carry. Hay, grain, a small bundle of herbs Sam swore would ease the infection, and a pair of hoof nippers, worn but functional. Sam gave him the tools at half price without explanation. As Elias loaded the supplies into the truck, Sam stepped outside, rubbing his hands against the cold. "You saving something that matters to you?" Sam asked. Elias glanced at the supplies, thought of hope lying in the storm cellar. "I'm trying to keep something alive," he said quietly. "For once." Sam nodded only once. "Good luck, Ward." By the time Elias drove back to Ward Hollow, the sky was fading into late afternoon. Snow fell in soft spirals. Hawk barked softly when he saw the cellar door ahead. Worn wood, cold stone, and the fragile pulse of survival hidden beneath. Inside, Hope lifted his head, nostrils flaring at the scent of hay. Elias set down the supplies and knelt beside the Mustang, letting the horse breathe him in. letting him know, this time, no one is leaving you behind. Hawk settled beside both of them, pressing close in silent solidarity. Elias exhaled slowly, deeply. The first real breath of purpose he'd felt in years. Night in Cedar Ridge arrived like a slow closing fist. The sky shifted from pale blue to bruised indigo, then finally into a shade of black, so deep it seemed to swallow sound itself. Elias Ward stepped out of the storm cellar, tugging the door closed behind him with the quiet care of a man refusing to disturb fragile peace. Hope needed rest, Hawk needed vigilance, and Elias, more than either of them, needed to gather strength for what tomorrow demanded. The yard lay silent under a thin crust of frost. The ruins of the old barn stood like the ribs of some ancient creature stripped down to bone. The moon hovered low, framed by the jagged silhouettes of pines. Elias lifted his face to the cold, trying to clear the burden pressing down on him. Inside the cellar, Hope had managed a few cautious bites of hay before exhaustion overtook him again. Elias had settled him with clean water and a blanket of straw. Hawk, refusing to sleep, had positioned himself near the base of the steps, ears pricked toward every ghost of sound. Now, as Elias scanned the shadows, he saw the faint flare of Hawk's eyes from below, watchful, unblinking. "You can rest, boy," he murmured, but Hawk did not move. Old soldiers never surrendered their posts. Elias started toward the truck to retrieve another lantern. His boots crunched softly on frozen earth. Far beyond the homestead, somewhere in the tangle of pines, a single sound rose. A low, muffled bark. Not hawk, not dog, not fox. Something heavier, something with hunger in it. Elias froze. The mountains bred predators, not the small kind, not the kind that ran, the kind that stalked. Mountain lions were rare, but not rare enough for comfort, especially when the scent of blood and weakness drifted on the wind. He scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but the silence shifted. Subtle, predatory. He turned back toward the cellar. "Hawk!" he whispered sharply. The dog's head snapped up. His ears shot forward. Then came that sound, the one Elias had trained him to use only in the gravest moments. 3 short barks, each clipped and urgent. They had used that signal in deserts, forests, bomb-shattered villages. Never once had Hawk given it in error. Elias's breath condensed in a rush. He snatched the lantern and moved toward the cellar, boots pounding the ground with a vigor his age rarely allowed. "Inside," he ordered. Hawk didn't need to be told twice. He darted up the steps, positioning himself in front of Hope, placing his aging body between danger and the wounded creature without hesitation. Elias reached the cellar door and turned sharply. Something moved near the barn's skeletal remains. A shadow detaching from deeper shadow. It slid across the ground with a fluid grace only apex predators possessed. Moonlight brushed whiskers, a long tail, broad shoulders, eyes that glowed like burnished copper. A mountain lion, larger than any Elias had seen this close. Its belly hung taut with hunger. Its movements held the restless tension of something that had followed the scent of weakness across miles. Elias lifted the lantern higher. "Easy now," he growled, voice steady as bedrock. "Don't." The lion crouched, a whisper of movement behind him, Hawk pressing against his leg, trembling with pain and an old injury but refusing to leave his master's side. "Back," Elias ordered. "Guard Hope." Hawk hesitated only a second before sliding behind him, placing himself halfway between the horse and the open door. His growl vibrated like a low drumbeat, a warning not of anger, but of duty. The lion took a step closer, another, then paused, nose lifting, tasting the air thick with hay, blood, and human resolve. Elias raised the lantern with one hand and reached for the revolver holstered under his coat with the other. The motion sent pain stabbing through his shoulder, but he kept his breath even. "You're not getting near them," he whispered. The lion answered with a sound halfway between a hiss and a growl, a noise that belonged to an animal that knew exactly how fragile human flesh was. "I'm not trying to kill you," Elias said softly, lifting the gun skyward, "but you need to back off." He fired a single round into the frozen ground. The shot cracked through the valley like shattering stone. Snow fell from nearby branches in glittering cascades. The lion jumped back, claws scraping against rock. Its ears flattened, its muscles tensed as if deciding whether instinct or fury would win. Elias didn't move. He stood rooted, a tree carved from old storms. The lion made its choice. With a final snarl, it retreated into the trees, vanishing as quietly as it had appeared. Elias waited a long moment before lowering the gun. Only when he could no longer hear the predator's steps did he exhale. Inside the cellar, Hawk emitted a sharp yelp of pain. Elias spun toward him and rushed down the steps. "What happened?" he whispered, kneeling. Hawk limped forward, favoring his right side. Elias pressed his fingers gently along the dog's ribs and felt it, a tight, hot knot of swelling near an old scar buried under fur. The lion hadn't touched Hawk. This was something older, reawakened by the sudden burst of movement and cold. "Your old wound," Elias murmured. "I pushed you too hard." Hawk lowered his head as if apologizing. "No," Elias whispered, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. "You kept us alive. Don't you ever be sorry for that." Hope shifted against the far wall, startled by the gunshot, but still too weak to stand. Elias placed a steadying palm on the horse's shoulder to calm him. "You're safe," he said gently. "Both of you." But the tremor in his voice betrayed the truth. Tonight had been close. Too close. And predators came back when hunger drove them. Elias rose, grabbed spare boards from the cellar wall, and reinforced the door. He stacked stone, wedged broken beams, created a crude but functional barrier. Everything in his body hurt by the time he finished, but the cellar was now a fortress. Hawk laid beside Hope, chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. Hope's eyes drooped, exhaustion overtaking fear. Elias sank onto a wooden crate. His hands shook, not from cold, but from the dawning realization of the world he had stepped back into. Saving Hope meant more than feeding, trimming, healing. It meant defending. It meant fighting. It meant choosing to stand his ground in a place where winter and predators and ghosts from his past circled like wolves. He rested one hand on Hawk's head, the other on Hope's warm flank. "You're both my responsibility now," he said softly, "and I won't fail you." The lantern flickered. The cellar breathed its ancient dusty breath. Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet, steady, relentless. But in that cramped stone shelter, Elias felt something shift inside him, a quiet conviction, a purpose older than fear. He wasn't just saving a horse. He was reclaiming the part of himself he'd buried 30 years ago, the man who still believed it mattered to fight for what was fragile. And that night, despite the ache in his bones and the looming threats beyond the cellar door, Elias Ward slept for the first time with a heart not haunted by emptiness, but steadied by duty. The first sign of the coming storm arrived not with thunder or wind, but with silence, an eerie, unnatural quiet that settled over Cedar Ridge like a held breath. By mid-afternoon, the sky had dulled to the color of bone, and the tree line blurred into a slow-moving wall of white. Elias Ward stepped out of the cellar and scanned the horizon. Snowflakes drifted lazily at first, dancing like small feathers. But there was a tension in the air that made the back of his neck tighten. A storm was coming. A big one. The kind that buried valleys, swallowed roads, and turned nights into tests of endurance. Hawk padded beside him, ears angled toward the sky. Even the old dog sensed it. Storms carried a frequency all their own. A warning pitched lower than human hearing, but sharp enough to stir instinct. "We have hours at best," Elias murmured. He looked toward the barn ruins. Beams slanted like broken ribs. Stones lay scattered. Nothing sturdy enough to hold even a child, much less a horse weakened by days of starvation. The cellar, then. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only lifeline he had. He moved quickly, fueled by urgency rather than strength. Hawk stayed glued to his flank, limping slightly from the weight he had carried last night, but determined to remain useful. First, Elias dragged half-collapsed boards from the barn debris, stacking them near the cellar door. Then he collected armfuls of dried meadow grass he had found near the old creek bed, what little hadn't been buried under early snows. He wasn't building a new shelter. He was trying to transform an ancient stone hole into a haven against a storm that didn't care about age or intention. He worked until his breath came shallow, until his hands numbed, until sweat mixed with cold air and chilled him straight through to the bone. By the time he opened the cellar door again, snow was driving sideways in sharp, stinging lines, tiny needles propelled by the rising wind. He ducked inside. Hope lifted his head, nostrils flaring, sensing the change outside. The lantern's amber glow flickered across the Mustang's tired but more alert eyes. "You've got to help me now," Elias said softly. "It's going to be rough tonight." He laid the dried grass across the floor to create insulation from the freezing dirt. Hawk crawled to a corner, sniffing the edges of the cellar wall where drafts seeped in through hairline cracks. "Find it," Elias whispered. Hawk pressed his nose to the stone, identified the worst draft, and stepped aside as Elias kneaded together a paste of mud and straw. Primitive, but effective. Something he'd learned decades ago from a local rancher who could fix anything using earth itself. He pressed the mixture into the cracks. The cold lessened. Another draft near the door, another behind the shelves, 3 more under the stairs. By the time he finished patching them, the wind outside had turned into a howl, a deep, rumbling voice that sounded as though the mountain's frozen lungs were exhaling in anger. Inside the cellar, the temperature became bearable. Not warm, but not killing cold. Elias sank onto the steps with a sigh of exhaustion. Then he heard it. A soft scratching. He lifted the lantern and turned. 2 small eyes glowed from beneath an overturned crate. A shiver of fur pressed tight against the shadows, thin, gray, and trembling. A stray cat. Where it had come from, he didn't know. How long it had been hiding here, he couldn't guess. It must have slipped inside earlier, when the door had been cracked open. Hawk approached first, moving slowly, lowering his head. The cat hissed once, weakly, then slumped back in fatigue. "Hush," Elias murmured, gently pushing Hawk aside. "It's just another wanderer." He lifted the crate, scooped the frail creature into his hands, and tucked it close to the hay near Hope. The cat curled instinctively into the warmth, pressing itself against the Mustang's flank, as if it had finally found a place in the world where claws and hunger were no longer needed. Elias stared at the scene, 3 broken beings huddled together in the dim light, and felt something heavy fracture inside him. Maybe monsters didn't always look like predators. Sometimes they looked like the past, and sometimes salvation looked like a horse, a dog, and a cat pressed together in a storm cellar. He checked the supplies again. Hay, grain, water, the herbal poultice Sam had given him. Enough for a night, maybe 2. Then he reached up, pulling the cellar door shut and locking the heavy bolts. Snow hit the wood like handfuls of gravel. The wind roared. The storm had arrived. Inside, lantern light painted the walls in trembling gold. Hawk lay against Elias's leg, letting out a low groan as an old ache flared in his hip. Elias stroked his fur, letting warmth pass between them. The dog had always endured without complaint. But tonight, Elias could see the toll of years. Hope shifted against the stone wall, breathing a little easier than yesterday. The herbs were helping slightly. The shelter was helping more. The stray cat slept, chest rising in soft, fragile puffs, its head pressed into the Mustang's mane as though the enormous animal were its mother. Hours passed. Snow hammered the door. Wind shook the stones. Darkness thickened. But nothing inside the cellar broke. At one point, Elias dozed, his head nodding to the rhythm of the storm. The lantern sputtered. Hawk's breathing warmed his palms. The sound of Hope's slow, rhythmic exhales lulled him into a half-dream. And in that dream, he stood in the old farmhouse kitchen. Before the fire, before the guilt. His mother hummed by the stove. His father sharpened tools at the counter, glancing back with a quiet pride Elias once took for granted. It was so peaceful, it hurt. He awoke with a start, breath trembling. The storm continued, relentless. But something, inside him, had changed. He looked around the cellar again, at Hawk, at Hope, at the stray cat curled in the hay. They depended on him wholly, not because he was strong, not because he was capable, but because he had chosen not to walk away. For decades, he had lived as if purpose was a distant memory. Tonight, in the belly of a storm, surrounded by creatures that clung to life simply because he offered it, purpose returned. When dawn finally arrived, the world outside the cellar was silent once more. Not the eerie silence before the storm, but the tender quiet that follows survival. Elias pushed open the heavy door. Snow stood halfway up the frame. Light spilled across the valley, turning the drifts into a sea of white fire. Behind him, Hawk rose shakily. Hope stirred. The stray cat yawned and burrowed deeper into the hay. Elias turned back to them with a faint, exhausted smile. "We made it," he whispered, and for the first time in many years, he felt as though he had too. Spring did not arrive gently in Cedar Ridge. It burst forth as if the earth had grown impatient with its own silence. Snowmelt trickled down ravines in sparkling ribbons. Birds returned in noisy flocks, and the valley, long frozen under winter's unforgiving rule, seemed to breathe again. Elias Ward stood at the edge of the pasture, leaning on a shovel, his boots sunk in the rich awakening mud. The sun warmed the back of his neck. He had forgotten how good sunlight felt, how it thawed not just the soil, but the bones. Behind him, Hawk limped through patches of fresh green, nose low as he investigated the new season's scents. The old dog's tail moved in small, determined sweeps, a quiet celebration of life after a storm that should have broken them. And ahead of him, Hope ran, really ran. The Mustang's hooves struck the soft earth in a rhythm so confident, so free, Elias nearly forgot the sight of the twisted, tortured feet he had found months ago in the ravine. Hope galloped in a wide circle, swinging his neck in a joyous arc, mane whipping in the wind. Each stride was a declaration. "I survived. I'm whole again. I am still a wild thing." Elias wiped sweat from his brow, blinking against the unexpected swell of emotion in his chest. "Look at you," he whispered, "like you were never broken at all." Hope reared once, an exuberant, almost defiant gesture, before settling into a steady canter. Hawk barked once, the sharp sound floating across the air like applause. For a moment, Elias simply stood there and let the world exist without pain. The land was waking up. The animals were healing. And for the first time in years, he felt connected to something larger than guilt or memory. He had not expected visitors that morning, but as he loaded the last of the old fencing into the wheelbarrow, a familiar rumble echoed from the road. The gravel shifted under approaching tires. Elias narrowed his eyes. A dusty sedan rolled slowly down the lane, its paint sun faded, its bumper held together with wire. The vehicle came to a halt beside the gate. A man stepped out. He was around Elias's age, maybe a touch older, his face lined with the softened exhaustion of someone who had fought long battles, though not always on battlefields. A worn veteran's cap sat low on his head, the insignia barely visible beneath grime and age. "Morning," the stranger called, lifting a hand. Elias nodded back, but didn't move closer yet. Hawk trotted forward, positioned himself between the two men, and sat. A guardian who announced boundaries simply by existing. The stranger smiled faintly. "Good-looking shepherd you've got there. Smart eyes." "Smarter than most men," Elias replied. The man chuckled. "Figures." He hesitated then, shifting weight from one foot to the other. He looked not at Elias, but at the sign on the post, freshly carved, the wood gleaming in the morning light. Phoenix Ridge. A sanctuary for the forgotten. The man's gaze softened. "I heard in town, this is the place that takes in strays." Elias let the words settle in the air. They felt oddly right, not rehearsed, not exaggerated, just true. "That's what they're saying?" Elias asked. "That's what I'm hoping." Finally, Elias shut the wheelbarrow stand, planted the shovel in the mud, and walked closer. Hawk followed, steady and alert. "What brings you here?" Elias asked. The man swallowed. For a moment, his voice cracked. "Winter took everything I had left. Lost my trailer outside Boise. Lost my old partner, a shepherd too, back in October." He cleared his throat. I need a place to land for a while. A place where folks don't look at a man like he's a burden." Elias stared at him, really stared, in a way that cut through the years of walls and weariness. He saw the tremble in the man's hands. the bruise-purple shadows beneath his eyes, the exhaustion carved into the slope of his shoulders. But more importantly, he saw himself, 30 years ago, then 10 years ago, then last fall, in every line of this stranger's face. A man carrying memories too heavy to set down. A man searching for a place where broken things were allowed to heal. Elias stepped aside and gestured toward the yard. "You hungry?" he asked simply. The man blinked, surprised by the ease of acceptance. "Yes, sir. I won't take much. I can work. I'm good with fences, engines, whatever you need." "I wasn't asking for a resume," Elias said. "I asked if you're hungry." For the first time in a long time, the man's shoulders loosened. Elias turned toward the shed. "Come on, coffee's still warm." As they walked, Hawk trotted beside the stranger, sniffed his hand, and then nudged it gently. Permission granted. The man chuckled through a small, disbelieving sound. I didn't catch your name." "Elias Ward." The stranger nodded. "Name's Grant." Inside the partially rebuilt shed, Elias poured 2 tin cups of coffee. Grant accepted his with both hands, inhaling the steam like it was salvation. Elias handed Hawk a treat from the bag on the counter. The dog accepted it with prim dignity. Grant looked around, the patched beams, the resurrected equipment, the carefully stacked supplies. "You built all this after the winter?" he said softly. Elias shrugged. "Had help." He nodded toward Hawk, toward the fields where hope now grazed peacefully, toward the small orange blur curled in the sun on a fence post, the stray cat who had decided sanctuary came with unlimited napping rights. Grant followed Elias's gaze and laughed softly. "Quite the crew you've got here. Family tends to look that way before it makes sense." The man nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to be part of it, even for a bit." And Elias realized something. He didn't feel fear at the thought, or distrust, or the old instinct to run. Instead, he felt gratitude, purpose, belonging. "I've got a spare cot in the shed," Elias said. "Roof doesn't leak much anymore. We'll fix it better come summer." Grant's eyes glistened. "Thank you." Elias walked outside, Grant trailing behind him. Hawk bounded into the yard as if to give a tour. The Mustang lifted his head from the new grass. His ears pricked forward at the sight of the newcomer, not with fear, but recognition. Another soul who had endured the cold. Elias glided a hand along Hope's neck. "This is Phoenix," he said, "the one who gave the ranch its name." Grant's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's beautiful." "He's a survivor," Elias replied. As if understanding the compliment, the Mustang stepped forward and brushed his warm muzzle against Elias's shoulder. Grant watched, awe softening the deep creases around his mouth. Elias inhaled deeply, letting spring's new air fill him. The ranch was no longer a ruin, no longer a graveyard, no longer a weight of guilt dragging behind him. It was a beginning. For Hope, for Hawk, for the stray cat, for Grant, for himself. He looked toward the road, where sunlight glowed on the valley like a promise. "Welcome to Phoenix Ridge," Elias said with quiet certainty. "This is where the forgotten find their way back." And for the first time since the fire that had taken everything from him 30 years ago, Elias Ward felt whole. In the quiet rise of Phoenix Ridge, we are reminded that God often sends his miracles not as thunder from the sky, but as small, steady signs hidden in the broken things around us. A wounded horse, an aging German shepherd, a weary veteran, a stranger on the road, each carried a spark of grace meant to guide another soul home. In our own lives, it is easy to believe we are too tired, too damaged, or too far gone to be useful again. But, just like Elias and his unlikely family, God whispers that healing is still possible, that new beginnings can grow from the coldest winter, and that no heart is ever beyond his touch. When we offer kindness, when we open our doors to those who have been forgotten, God breathes life into places we thought were lost. That is the quiet miracle of everyday compassion. That is how he rebuilds us, one act of love at a time. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Comment Amen to send a prayer across our community. And if you believe in stories that honor faith, loyalty, and second chances, we invite you to subscribe and join our family. May God bless you, keep you safe, and guide your steps through every valley you walk.